Rogers once said he never met a man he didn't like. The guest with us tonight kind of paraphrases that. Attorney Mark Huberman says he never met a kid he couldn't rehabilitate. And that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight, is juvenile justice, the youthful offenders, how they get there, what happens to them, and how Attorney Huberman, who is one of the most active attorneys in the juvenile justice arena in this area, helps deal with that. You never met a kid you couldn't rehabilitate, really?
Well, I think that was a bit of journalistic license that was taken by the editorial writers of the Vindicator. I didn't exactly say that. I said that outside of really hardcore cases, I never saw a kid, at least I've never come across a kid that I didn't think could be reached, that could be touched and motivated in constructive manners and to overcome. I think kids can be reached. I didn't really say that I've never met a kid that I couldn't rehabilitate. I've never been in a position to totally rehabilitate, but I have been in a position to, I think, improve a lot of young people's lives, and I feel very satisfied that I've been able to do that.
Let's take a step back for a second. You're relatively new in the legal profession. You've only been in, what, 3 years or so?
I will be 3. In fact, I think I just passed the anniversary of November 19th. Was when I became licensed, 1976.
With all of the areas, all of the options in terms of arenas that you could practice in, areas that you could specialize in, areas where your help might be needed, what brought you to juvenile offenders, juvenile justice?
Well, I think I enjoy and am very satisfied by the whole area of family law. It's an opportunity to work with people, and up until I started practicing law, I don't think I had the opportunity to directly be involved with working with kids. And when I had that experience, gained that experience with 4, 5, 10 kids, all of a sudden I began to realize, well, this is a pretty satisfying thing to do. And in general, my practice has kind of become concentrated in the areas of domestic relations, adoptions, family work, a landlord-tenant, basically things that involve people's problems. And in the area of children, I've been fortunate in being able to empathize and relate with kids, and the limit of my work as a lawyer seems to be my imagination and creativity in coming up with alternatives and options and alternative placements and alternative ways of dealing with their problems.
What are some of those? Tell me some of the alternative options that you've come up with for juvenile offenders.
Well, one of the things that you can find if you work at it is finding, rather than institutional placements, working for more residential placements. In other words, rather than a young kid who gets into trouble being committed to the Ohio Youth Commission to some kind of just lock-up facility, doing the best you can to try to find a group home, trying to find a residential setting someplace, trying to find vocational education for someone who's just not fitting into the normal school realm, say he's a persistent runaway or she's a persistent runaway, finding those kinds of placements. I've found one of the things that I've been very satisfied with is that I've found in a number of young kids there's a lot of creative talent, and if you can tap into it, if you can discover it, and if you can channel it, it kind of is a motivating factor for a lot of kids who have a hell of a lot of energies, but they're just channeled in the wrong directions. If you can channel them in the right direction, you find a lot more, you can take a maladjusted kid and find and discover a lot of adjustment.
Can you give me some examples of how you might have done that?
Well, I've found some kids that, from a very personal standpoint, I have gotten involved in art programs that some of which the university sponsors. There was just one this summer, which I was instrumental in getting a couple of young people involved in. There are dance programs in the community that you can, work kids into that have those kinds of interests. By bridging the gap between the juvenile court and the Children's Services Bureau, a lot of cases which may be labeled delinquent can be looked at in a different manner. I mean, how do you sometimes distinguish between someone who is a runaway and steals a car to facilitate his runaway? Is that an unruly child, or is that a delinquent child? Now, he's committed an act that would be a crime if it was an adult, but it's really unruly, and depending on how well you argue that it's an unruly child, and you can have the child within the jurisdiction of the Children's Services Board, a whole plethora of options open to you, and though their funds are very limited, you can certainly do a lot more and keep the child in the community.
Are the courts open to these kinds of initiatives that you're proposing?
Well, here in Mahoning County, and that's where my largest experience is, I found in Judge Joyce to be one of the most receptive judges that I've ever seen to creative kind of planning, and I think his biggest frustration has been the lack of alternative programs and people working towards coming up with non-institutional placements. And one of the reasons that he moved the Juvenile Justice Center up to Youngstown University, and they built it up near the university, was to have the option and the availability of university programs, university personnel to be involved with kids. And but he's been one of the most responsive people that I've ever dealt with as a judge in terms of creative sentencing and creative ways of dealing with problems. He's very, very committed towards helping any kid that comes along.
How do you, as an attorney, how does he, as a judge, tell when that child that you're dealing with, that youth, is no longer simply unruly, is a criminal? And
well, he has of course, the judge has a dual responsibility in cases. He has to be concerned with the safety of the community, as well as he does the best interests and the rehabilitation of the particular child. And sometimes when you have a child that commits an act of delinquency by way of first-degree murder, kills someone, well, different kind of considerations come in. So I guess it's a function of the seriousness of the crime. The less serious it is, the more latitude and the more openness that you will find towards rehabilitation. I have a theory along that line, too, that outside of very rare cases, there is a continuum that you can find between those that start out as a discipline problem at home that might be classified as your quote-unquote classic unruly child, and then those that are truant from school, and then whatever problems that child has not being sufficiently dealt with, you'll find that child will along the line become your runaway, then he will become your delinquent, and then if not dealt adequately with as a delinquent, this is where you're going to have your young adult offenders.
Let's talk about the role of some of the institutions in developing a delinquent, a juvenile offender. What role does the home environment play?
I don't think there's any question that that is the largest role that there is, and my own feeling, my own experience, not that long, but it has told me, and I believe that the breakdown of family units is in part tremendously responsible for the rise in juvenile problems. You look at our divorce rate, as 1 out of 2, 2 out of 4 are getting divorced. In Mahoning County, there's only slightly more marriages filed every month than divorces. And in general, where you don't have any children involved and you have dissolutions of marriage, there's nothing so troublesome about that. But when there are children involved, that's where they're inevitably pawns. And in, I would say, 8 out of 10 divorces that I handle, there is a battle over custody. And even if it's not a battle over custody, if a husband, the child's of a very tender age, in general, you will see custody still granted to the mother. And there will be, even if a father, for example, is resigned to the fact that custody is going to be in one direction, it still can become a very tense and turbulent kind of situation. Out of these broken situations, this is where you're finding a heck of a lot of alienated kids. And out of alienation, that's when I believe kids are turning to drugs, grass. They're just going off on their own, very simplistic highs, rather than the kind of more traditional highs that probably you and I were used to when we were growing up, though it's not that many years ago, but of being involved with our parents and going on trips, camping and to the park. This isn't happening. Kids are pawns in many, many cases, and in, I would say, a good 70% of the cases of whether you call them delinquents, neglected, unruly, dependent, they're out of broken homes. And this isn't just something that's a function of the inner city. It's a function of all over our community, in the suburbs and everywhere else.
Brings me to a couple of other elements that I'd like to discuss. Drugs. What role do drugs play in furthering the juvenile offender
I believe that, I feel personally that they're playing an enormous role, and one of the unfortunate things one of the unfortunate trends that I think we're seeing today is the liberalization of the availability of marijuana, and that a lot of the studies saying that it simply is, no worse than cigarettes, and newer studies coming out all the time are showing that just isn't so. And my feeling is that it is having an effect, a psychological effect, maybe something that's very long-term. We're not seeing an immediate cause effect. Person smokes a few joints and he immediately has some kind of psychotic episode. But over a period of time, it's changing personalities. And I think some of the normal, maybe control mechanisms which children would exhibit in choosing right and wrong, and choosing to stay at home, respecting parents and things like that, that's what's changing. And the control mechanisms aren't just there, and they're acting on the moment. They're not planning. I find, I think I've explained to in previous interviews and things that I see a lot of, for want of a better word, very empty kind of kids without a lot of motivation. They don't seem to have human relationships, whether it's with parents or with others. They seem to lack that ability. They go out, they get high. They go out, they snatch a purse, and without much thought as to the consequences. And that's why one of the reasons that I'm very skeptical about some of the people that talk about just stiff penalties, that this is we're gonna deter crime, particularly of youth, by stiff penalties, because I don't think they're thinking about penalties, and I don't think that repeatedly putting people away that's not going to be in the uppermost of their mind when it's taking place.
How much of juvenile crime is not really a crime for personal gain in the sense that I need the money, but crime that is more mischievous, vandalism, middle-class youth who go out and snatch purses or shoplift or steal cars?
Well, it's hard to say. I remember several years ago I represented some children in one of the suburban areas here in town who, within a space of a couple of months, had admitted to 80 and 90 house burglaries. Well, these were not hardened criminals. This was not the mob. They were a group of young kids, but somehow their value system, as I say, is just rather shallow, and they just seemed to do it because they did it once, and well, it worked, and it was fun or whatever. They didn't seem to have anything else to do, a lot of time off. They didn't seem motivated by school. They seemed bored by school, so this is what they did. Well, it seems, as the records in Mahoning and Trumbull County over the last year will show, is that the mischief is getting much more serious. And that's why I think we're really going to have to take, in the 80s, a very hard look at what's going on here. And if the focus continues to be on just putting more in jail and putting more in jail, that's not going to be the solution.
You're saying mischief, by that you mean that it's becoming more prevalent, or that it's taking more dangerous forms?
It's taking more dangerous forms.
And
right.
Can
With
you give
the
me some
same
examples?
kind of basically forgivable motivation, but nevertheless, it's just of enormous severity, and the consequences
So we're moving from
are just tremendous.
crimes against property to crimes against person, then?
It really is, yes.
What role do the schools play, and what role should the schools play?
I think the schools can play an enormous role there, too. And I think, unfortunately, this is a time of very simplistic answers to very complex problems. The answer seems to be, well, we just don't have enough of the 3 R's. We don't have enough discipline. If we just, whack them, give them a whack in the rear, that's all that you need to solve your discipline problems. But I take strong exception to it. I don't think that's the solution. I think we've got to start motivating kids in school, and I'm a firm believer and a staunch advocate of kind of what I would call creative education, having more things that tapping talents and creativity that children have. If they're theater as therapy, art as therapy, it can do a lot, not necessarily in a structured therapeutic sense, but it has a much larger role. Kids that are in theater and are in a play and are really inspired to get the grease paint on their face, and they get under the footlights, and it's very inspiring to them, they'll soon realize that to be able to read a script, you've got to learn to read. And to be able to be in developing film, if you're working with cameras, you've got to know how to do different kinds of calibrations. You've got to learn arithmetic. But there's a reason to do that. There's a motivation to do that. And that it does happen, it does work.
Do you think there's a failure on the part of the schools to show the students that everything they learn should be related? And I remember one of my teachers saying, the key is not that you learn English and that you learn history and that you learn mathematics, but that you learn English and find out how that's related to the mathematics you learn and how that's related to the history you learn.
I agree with that a lot. I remember during the campaign for the Board of Education, Tony Julian, one of the candidates for it, who was elected, by the way, was an advocate of consumer education in school, teaching kids mathematics. And one of the ways of teaching them mathematics was teaching them, you know, when you buy something in a jumbo size and an economy size, just what you're saving, things that they can identify with. If you learn calculations in ways that you can identify, it'll be much more meaningful to you. I remember when I was in high school and they tried to teach me long division. To this day, I don't think I understand long division, but I think very much, I agree very much that it needs to be an education that people can identify with. And I think if people would learn reading by reading plays and acting out the plays, all of a sudden I think your comprehension of what you just read becomes a lot more meaningful. You begin identifying even with roles if you act out a play.
Let's talk about one of the recent cases that you handled, and that was the case of an 18-year-old youth who killed a couple who were running a service station. Let's talk about that for illustrative purposes, not that case specifically, okay, but use that to talk about
it is
some
pending
things.
On appeal, and
yeah. So rather than using that specifically, I'm trying to recap, and correct me if I recap wrongly here. One of the things that he said was that he didn't really feel he knew what he was doing because he had smoked some joints, I think 10 joints or something like that. Is that pretty indicative of what happens when youth come into court hearings anymore, that they just say, well, you know, I didn't know what I was doing?
No, I would say it's very rare, and it's something that was rather new in this case. It happened also to be raised in Trumbull County in a case at the same time, but I think we are among the first, in this case, Attorney Jim Gentile and myself, to have raised that defense. We raised it because we had it, and the young man had stated to us, and that immediately prior to the shootings that he had admitted to, that he had, in a chain fashion, ingested 8, 9 joints in a row. And that is a lot of marijuana to ingest, and as we all know, just like some people when they drink, some people get slap happy, some get very violent, some get very ornery. Different alcohol drugs affect different individuals in different ways. And Ohio law says that if you have been a habitual user of marijuana, which this young man claimed to have been, and if, or in the alternative, if at the time of the commission of a crime that you were so intoxicated that you may have been incapable of forming the specific intention to commit that specific crime. And in this case, the challenge was not to his having intended to commit a robbery, but was his intent to kill 2 individuals involved. The jury did not believe that he was intoxicated. All there was really his testimony that he was. Or in the alternative, as 1 or 2 of the jurors said to me after the trial, their basic feeling was that that no one is above the law, and if you commit a crime of that severity, you owe a debt to society, which you have to pay. Which brings to mind what a law professor said to me in my freshman year of law school. I was teaching civil procedure, and but he was commenting on the criminal realm and talking to us about how juries look at very complicated cases. If you've ever watched in court, the judge will give these long instructions to the jury that are so complicated you couldn't figure them out if you had 5 years to understand. But basically, this law professor said, you know, that when a jury retires to consider a case, he said, they don't decide the law, they just decide whether or not they want to send a clown to jail. And that's pretty much what was involved here. They felt that this individual just had to go to jail for what he did.
Do you think the youth should have been rehabilitated rather than incarcerated?
Well, again, you know, you have a balance, the safety of the community and the hope for the individual. From a personal standpoint, I really do believe that that is what accounts for what this young man did in that crime. I'm convinced of it. I was with that young boy from the time that he was arrested as a juvenile. And he came before the court having never committed an act of even delinquency before. No, not even a significant problem in school. And a very nice boy, well-liked. And maybe the most interesting thing about him is that from the time of his arrest in the county jail, and that's where he was placed immediately, for almost a full year until he was tried, he was a model prisoner. They would kid about him and say that if the detectives had told him to go out and get a Wendy's and be back in 10 minutes, he would, with change.
But he killed 2 people.
He killed 2.
And you can't dismiss that.
Well, the jury did not, and it's not my role as an attorney, as a defense attorney, is not to be the judge and jury. It's to present the best kind of defense that I can for him. And in this particular case, I felt it was an appropriate defense. It wasn't a defense based on excuse. It was a defense based on mitigation, and one that I still believe today was appropriate.
Do you get most of your cases in the public defender's role, or are you hired by parents or relatives of the youth? How do you handle most of your cases?
Well, it's shifted a bit. I think when you start out as a young lawyer, the courts tend to help you along and give you experience, particularly in the lesser cases, crimes of less severity in your public defender role, and kind of helps you pay your bills and pay your rent, and you learn a heck of a lot without too much of a price being paid by anyone. And then as you get along, you will get, as I did in the John David King case, one of much more severity after I had been around a few years and gained a bit of experience. But now, well, I have some seniority around here. There's other young lawyers, you know, knocking at my door and challenging the practice, so they tend to get first call on them. So the number of court appointments that I have has gone down, although in juvenile court, I still get a significant number of cases, probably because I enjoyed doing them. And
you seem to enjoy the work you're doing, to feel very strongly about the work you're doing. Do you have a problem getting too emotionally involved with a client?
I think that I did, much more so than I do now. I probably am more selective now than I used to be, and I tend to get emotionally involved with those that, well, it's like the good book says, the Lord will help those that help themselves. And those that want to help themselves, they'll get a hell of a lot out of me, and I find a lot of satisfaction in helping them. It does something for me as much as it hopefully does something for them, and but I'm much more selective, and it's unfortunate that it's not all of the people, whether young defendants or adults, that have that sufficient motivation that they do want to help themselves.
How do you tell if a kid is one of those who comes in and is sincere and says, gee, I really would like help? Well, differentiate him from the kid who comes in and says, I really would like help, but is putting you on.
One of the things you have to be careful about is that there are those that will give you a good line and will put you on. And
are there any telltale signs? In case any prospective attorneys are watching so they'll know in the future.
Well, I think it's just instinct. The more you've been around, the more you can kind of pick up catchphrases and inconsistencies and things like that. And I, from a personal standpoint, I kind of approach particularly young defendants off the wall. I'll throw all kinds of things at them about their feelings about art, their feelings about music, their feelings about politics, their feelings about their parents, their feelings about drugs. And from that battery of questions, almost like my personal MMPI, and I find out a heck of a lot about what makes them tick and where their interests are. And I was real good in undergraduate school, I thought. One time we had an exercise in an argument class, which we had, of trying to psych out your audience and say the things that you think that they will want to hear, and what your objective is to kind of glean their political values. And I'm excellent at it. I've always thought I was excellent at it anyway, and so I've been pretty successful. I haven't been burned too many times.
Very briefly, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing in Ohio's juvenile justice system, what might that be?
Oh, very, very simply, I'd have a heck of a lot more group homes, residential homes. Here, it's a crime that we have an awful lot of disenfranchised and disenchanted youth, and no place to put them. We have in Mahoning County the Children's Services Board for just the status offenders, the unruly, the dependent, neglected, have 1, 2, 3, I think 4 group homes that are available, and one of them is Daybreak. You really can't count that. That's just a runaway shelter, and there's no place to put them. You have to wait months to get a placement here, and there just aren't a lot of options for, even when you are being creative, of where to put them.
But you can understand in neighborhood homeowners' hesitancy to have that kind of home in their neighborhood.
They're very hesitant. They're very hesitant. But I think the thing people have to begin to understand is what the long-term cost of this is going to be. Short-term, yeah, let's just let someone else worry about them. But the status offenders of today are the robbers, the burglars, even unfortunately the murderers of tomorrow. And if we just, it's that old maxim about an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And I was just looking, there's an article that ran October 31st in the Vindicator on jail for juvenile offenders urged, and there's a preliminary report out on a study by the LEAA that focused on 200 ghetto youth in Chicago, and said that there was an incredible observation here that suppose you were arrested 10 times and put on probation 10 times, you wouldn't believe that anything was going to happen the 11th time. Well, if I ever, it's just ridiculous that anyone would be put on probation 10 times. It doesn't happen, and the problems are a lot more than the inner city youth. And if the only solution that they have is more institutionalization and more jail, they're going to find out, because you're not going to keep them in jail forever. And in juvenile institutions, that you can only hold them there generally till they're 18. And if we don't be a little more creative in trying to focus on just what the problems are that brought this about, then we're all going to pay a price down the road.
Thank you very much. Attorney Mark Huberman was our guest tonight, and we discussed juvenile offenders, juvenile delinquency, and juvenile justice. Once again, thank you very much.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm Randall Gerber. Join us again when it's nighttime.